Hello, everyone. Looks like everybody is filtering in to today's webinar. Thanks, everyone, for joining our session today. I'm Christine Garver-Apgar. I am the Research and Evaluation Director for BHWP. And today's guest speaker and I share a research background in the evolutionary behavioral sciences. So I am especially delighted to introduce Dr. Willem Frankenhuis. Dr. Frankenhuis is a research psychologist. He is a biologist. He is an anthropologist, and he has held positions in all of those departments. He is currently an associate professor of evolutionary and population biology at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And he is also a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Crime, Security, and Law in Freiburg, Germany. Dr. Frankenhuis studies how people develop in harsh and unpredictable conditions, and his empirical work focuses on uncovering hidden talents that people may develop in response to adversity and reasonable adaptive responses that people may have to adverse conditions, even if those present costs. And so I know that he's going to share some of his work in those areas with us today. So I'm super happy to listen to his talk today. I'm very excited. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Frankenhuis.
Well, thank you, Christina. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to exchanging ideas with everyone here. So I'll be talking about developmental adaptations to stressful environments, and my talk consists of four parts. And I start off a little bit more biological, then I get a bit more into the psychology, and then into the applications. And so the first part is focusing on the evolution of plasticity and learning. The second part on early adversity in human evolution. The third part is about adaptive strengths and strategies. And then the fourth part is about new pathways to improving lives based on these adaptation-based approaches. Now, I'll start off with an infamous quote by Charles Darwin. In The Origin of Species, his wonderful book, he did not say much about humans, except towards the very end. There he said, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important research. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation." And the term psychology in this quote really refers to the social sciences at large. And so in this book, focusing on birds and beetles and butterflies, at the very end, he says, "I foresee that this way of thinking will have implications for the social sciences." Now we're 150 years later, and Darwin's prophecy has become partially realized, but there are also obstacles towards its realization, and those obstacles include misconceptions about evolved traits. What does it mean for a trait to be evolved? What characteristics do evolved traits have? And so it's widely believed in the social sciences that evolved traits would have to be present at birth, that they must be stable over the course of development, that they are universal in the species, shared by all members of a species, and that they are not learned. But consider a trait like puberty, which is an evolved human trait, but it's not present at birth, and it's changing across development. And so these characteristics actually do not need to be part at all of evolved traits. But if you do think that these traits are associated with evolved traits, then you think that things like species typical change over the course of development fall outside the scope of evolutionary thinking, or individual differences, for example, in how we deal with stress. If you think that individual differences fall outside the scope of evolutionary thinking, then that perspective does not have much to add to studying individual differences. And actually, I will argue the opposite in this talk. And then cultural variation would fall outside the scope of evolutionary thinking because it is clearly learned. But this is not the right way to think about how evolution and development are related. So it's better to think of these processes not as being kind of opposing, but rather as being nested. So across generations, the evolutionary process favors some psychological mechanisms and some developmental mechanisms over others. And it favors those developmental mechanisms that within a generation enable individuals to construct adaptive bodies, brains, and minds. And so there's a between generation process, which favors mechanisms. I like to think of those as toolkits. It favors some toolkits over others. And it favors those toolkits because within generations, through interactions with the environment, these toolkits tend to construct individuals that are capable of surviving and reproducing in a particular environment. And so, on this view, these evolved developmental mechanisms can produce species typical changes during development. They can produce individual differences. Think about the stress response system. We all have a stress response system, and yet we deal with stress differently. And that's in part a function of our different developmental histories. What the developmental mechanism is doing is it's using information from our childhoods and from our current experiences to adjust our stress response system to the local environment. But the ability to do those adjustments, that's an evolved ability. And then cultural variation relies on social learning mechanisms that humans are equipped with, but other organisms may not be equipped with, such as nematodes, for example, or ants. They might not have those psychological mechanisms that enable them to acquire information socially in the way that humans do. And so, on this perspective, evolution and development and learning are all mutually compatible with each other rather than in opposition to each other. And so in this talk, I'm going to focus mainly on plasticity, and that's the ability of organisms to adjust to their environment. And what's adjusted depends a little bit on the level at which we study it. So some people study it at the level of the brain. So our brain structure and function can adjust based on our experiences to the environment, but also the way we process information. So for example, if we see an ambiguous facial expression, do we interpret it as hostile or as friendly? That kind of information processing is also something that develops over the course of our childhoods and into our adulthood based on our experiences with others in our environment. And then we adjust our behavior also based on our experiences. And so that's called plasticity in psychology. In biology, people often call this phenotypic plasticity. And I just highlight this because phenotypic plasticity is really widespread in nature. And so the ability to adjust to different environmental circumstances, including dangerous ones or unpredictable ones or situations with low resources, are things that we see all across the tree of life. And I just want to highlight one amazing example from the non-human animal world. And after that, I will mainly focus on humans. And it's the case of Daphnia. Those are little crustaceans that live in the water. And on the left side, you see a picture of two Daphnia, and has a helmet and the other does not. But these two Daphnia actually are genetically identical. They are clones, but they've had different experiences. One has grown up with predators in its environment, and the other without predators in its environment. And the one that has the helmet is the one that grew up with the predators. And what the helmet does, and you can show this experimentally, is it reduces their risk of being predated on. So a helmet is like protective armor. And what's beautiful about this species is that these baby Daphnia, when they're inside the egg, inside the mother is diffusing chemical signals to the baby, basically communicating that there are threats, that there are predators in the environment. And then the baby already inside the egg starts growing this helmet. And then postnatally, after birth, the Daphnia is sampling from the water chemicals that are released when predators are chewing on conspecifics. And those chemicals are called chiromones. And so they sample these chiromones and then they grow an even larger helmet. And so it's very interesting that the mothers are already preparing the offspring for a hostile environment. And then postnatally, the babies are learning more about their environment and adapting to it. And so what this is showing is that natural selection, the evolutionary process of natural selection, can produce mechanisms of plasticity that allow individuals during their development to sample information from their environment, to learn from their experiences, and to then develop characteristics like helmets, but it can also be behaviors, as we will see in humans, that are adaptive to the state of the environment. And it could be the case that those characteristics also have costs. So, for example, growing this helmet might be energetically expensive for the Daphnia, or it could slow down its foraging behaviors. But it's essential to have these characteristics when growing up in this hostile environment. So that was the first part of my talk. And now we'll move to discussing early adversity in human evolution. Now, important question when thinking about how humans adapt to adversity is to wonder what are the kinds of adversities that humans might be able to adapt to. And here, there are perspectives in clinical and developmental psychology that are quite prominent in the field, but that I do want to say a few critical things about. And so one notion in this area is that of an expectable environment, and it refers to the species typical environmental inputs that the human brain requires to develop normally. Now, this is a definition. I personally don't love this definition because something like what does normal development mean is, I think, a very difficult question to answer. But, it's a choice to maybe define it in this way. But then here comes the sort of assumption in this area, which is that adverse events represent a violation of the expectable environment. And so, what this argument is that when individuals experience adversity, like chronic exposure to threat or unpredictability or nutritional stress, then these things fall outside the scope of the environments that humans have evolved to be able to adapt to. Now, why does that matter when people think this is the case? It matters because in clinical and developmental science, it's often thought that those types of experiences that fall outside the scope of the expectable environment increase the risk of developing psychopathology. I personally think that this is not true in all cases. And but if you want to test this type of theory, it really matters what this expectable environment was like. What were the types of adversities that human infants and children really did experience over the course of evolutionary history? And this is an empirical question. And so clinicians and developmental psychologists who are working from this perspective, they really need to build interdisciplinary bridges with other disciplines like anthropology, primatology, bioarchaeology, human history, demography, because those fields have studied for decades what childhoods have been like over the course of human history in hunter-gatherer populations or in more recent industrialized populations. And so understanding something about, for example, the infant and child mortality rates and the sources of those mortality rates will be important in understanding the kinds of adversities that have operated on humans over evolutionary time. Now, when studying evolution, we have a very difficult problem, which is we cannot look into the past directly, right? We can maybe find archaeological remains or we can look at other species, but we cannot look into the past. And so the way that people try to infer infant and child mortality rates over evolutionary time is through a method called triangulation. And so triangulation means that you ask the same question about, for example, what were adversities like over human evolution, and you look at it through different lenses. So you look at it through the lens of bioarchaeology, history, demography, and so on. And then you triangulate from these different sources of evidence what would be the likely answers to those questions. And if all those different methods give you similar answers, it increases your confidence in that answer. But if the different methods give you different answers, then it just means that you're not very certain. Now, in this case, the different methods do give similar answers, and those answers are actually devastating. When I first saw the following statistic, I was really shocked, and I still am very shocked by this statistic. So, Our World in Data, which is one of the sort of leading repositories for information on this subject, concludes that before the industrialized revolution, child mortality was very high in all societies that we have knowledge of. A quarter of all children died in the first year of life, and almost half died before reaching the end of puberty. Now, these statistics refer to infants that are born alive. And so, historically, current estimates are, and of course, this varied over space and time, but historically, estimates are that if you were born alive, your odds of making it past the age of 15 were a little bit better than a coin flip. And so that means that over the course of human evolution, adversity has been highly prevalent. Now, that matters because that means that it's likely that there has been selection for dealing with various forms of adversity on the mechanisms that humans are equipped with. And those mechanisms are interacting with contemporary environments to produce some of the psychological characteristics and some of the behaviors that we see. I also just want to highlight one conceptual thing. So in this literature that that I highly admire and respect for many reasons, but where I am a little bit critical of this idea of the expectable environment and making inferences based on that about the risk of psychopathology, is how adversity is defined in this literature. So it's defined there as negative environmental experiences that likely require significant adaptation of the average child and that represent a deviation from the expectable environment. Now, that seems to imply that if there's an experience that falls within the expected range of environments, then we should not call it adversity because it's not a deviation from this expectable environment. Now, take something like losing a sibling when you're a child. Over evolutionary time, unfortunately, that has been a very common experience. That's been regular enough for sure to be able to be called part of the typical environment that children, experienced over evolutionary time. And yet, we know also from archaeologists and from anthropologists doing cross-cultural work, we know that it's a devastating experience for families when children die. And that includes also societies where infant and child mortality rates are high. There too, it's a devastating experience. And so I think we should call, losing a sibling an adverse environment, even if over evolutionary time that has been a common form of adversity. And so I would probably redefine adversity as something like, and I'm sure this definition is imperfect and can be improved, but as something like negative experiences that tend to produce prolonged intense stress among individuals living in a given socio-ecological context and not as a deviation from an expectable environment. Okay. So if you want to read more about like the exact statistics and the sources of mortality, so things like disease was like the main source of mortality, but also violence, including infanticide, was a form of mortality. And if you want to read more about those statistics and the kinds of evidence it's based on, you can have a look at this paper that I wrote together with my colleague Dorsa Amir, and it's about what is the expected human childhood. And it's trying to bring this literature closer to the anthropology and the biology. So then the third part of my talk, which is about adaptive strengths and strategies. Now, I had the curious fortune to grow up in Artis Amsterdam Zoo. And this is because my father was general director there for almost 14 years. So when I was 9, we moved into a house in the zoo because when you have that position, there are 3 positions in the zoo, the general director, the financial director, and the head zookeeper, where you have to live in the zoo in a house as a punishment for having that job. And so that was, of course, a special experience. And when I would go to school, other kids would ask me whether I was in the third cage on the left or something like that. And then I would just be like, oh, you're like the millionth person to make that joke. But yes, it is really, it's, of course, a wonderful experience for a child to grow up in this circumstance. And my father had a background more kind of in medicine, but he was very interested in the evolution of characteristics of animals. And so we would walk through the zoo in the evening after closing time, and he would say, why do you think these peacocks have such exuberant feathers? The males have these colorful, exuberant feathers. They are large, they're energetically expensive to produce. If a predator sees them, they might get stuck in the bushes with these feathers. Also, they're highly conspicuous. And then I would be like, well, I don't know. I mean, they're beautiful. They look beautiful. And then my dad was like, well, yes, but the predator also finds them beautiful, and so it's very costly for their survival. And I'd be like, well, maybe the females are more likely to mate with males that have these exuberant feathers. And then my dad would say, well, that's true, but that means that their sons are also more likely to grow these feathers. And so why would the females want to mate with males that have these? And so he would kind of asked me to reflect on the costs and benefits of characteristics for animals, and so that got me really interested in the evolution, of human behavior mainly, and that was difficult to study in the Netherlands. And so I went to the United States, to the University of California in Los Angeles, where I pursued a PhD in biological anthropology. And in this department, it was just a wonderful experience, like a kid in the candy store. I arrived there, and everyone knew more about this topic than I did, even, the people of my own age. And I was just learning from everyone, and we were all having wonderful conversations. And so I was going to be there only for 1 year initially, just as sort of an exchange program, but I ended up staying for 5.5 years, completing the whole program. And yeah, I just loved it. So that was a great experience. And during this PhD, there were some findings that I learned about in the field that stood out to me. And one of those findings was that rodent pups and also birds, when they are tested in terms of their ability to memorize information or to solve problems, if they've grown up in a more adverse environment. So for the rodent pups, that means, for example, that they receive low levels of maternal care when the mother is stressed, maybe because there are predators or maybe because she has difficulty finding materials to build a nest. It means that the mother is attending less to the pups. She's not licking and grooming the pups as much, and that primes the pups to become stressed. And those pups that come from low levels of licking and grooming tend to score lower on many tests of kind of mental ability. But when they were tested on in an experiment where they needed to learn where in the environments there were threats and they needed to memorize those threats, they actually outperformed pups that grew up with mothers that were giving them high levels of licking and grooming. And so it stood out to me that these rodent pups had these mental abilities that were not just impaired, but that also showed enhancements for solving problems that were particularly relevant for them. And similar findings have been observed in birds. So this stood out to me. Another finding that stood out to me, and this is one of my favorite psychological research studies ever. This was work done first in Brazil, later in India. And there were researchers interested in studying the arithmetic abilities of youth who were selling fruits and vegetables on the streets. And many of these children came from very harsh backgrounds. So, for example, in this sample, about half of the children were experiencing homelessness in Brazil in the 80s. And and so the researchers gave these children arithmetic tasks in the classroom, and these children performed not very well at all. And so the researchers concluded that these children have cognitive impairments for arithmetic. But then there were Brazilian researchers who said, well, wait a minute. When I buy goods from these children in the market and I say, hey, I would like to have 12 bananas, 15 oranges, and, 2 pieces of bread, these children give me very accurate and very fast answers to how much money I owe them. So they can do this arithmetic, but they can do it in the context that is relevant to them. And so then the researchers did a very ingenious study. This is so clever. They they went to buy products from these children as mystery shoppers. And so they would ask these children, for products that were of equivalent complexity to the classroom problem solving questions. And then the children would answer and they would write down the answer. And then afterwards, they would say to the children, hey, I actually am a researcher and I asked you these questions because I wanted to understand how you solve mathematical problems. Am I allowed to use your answers as research data? And hopefully, they also compensated these children for their participation. But what the results were of this study is that these children on the market were actually very accurate and very fast, basically as accurate as children who are used to solving math in classroom settings are when they solve math in the classroom. And so this study was very recently replicated by Banerjee and colleagues. Banerjee is actually a Nobel Prize winner a few years ago, not for this line of research, but this is part of what he's done and his group. And they replicated this result also in children in India. But what it showed, and this is what the takeaway is of this study, is that when individuals solve problems in a context that is relevant to them, they can sometimes do a lot better than when they need to solve it in a context that is unfamiliar or irrelevant to them. So, sort of armed with this information, I was looking at the developmental and the clinical psychology literature, and there was, widespread agreement that people have evolved the ability to adapt to acute stressors in the environment. Like if a lion, walks into our space, we fight or flight or freeze, or, we increase our vigilance when we feel threatened, and so on. So that's something that everybody agreed with, that those threats were part of evolutionary history. But when it comes to people being exposed to prolonged intense stress, which unfortunately many people are, including, of course, many of the people that that you are working with. Um, the model there is that, these exposures to this adversity tends to impair brain structure and function in ways that lowers cognitive ability. That's the dominant view in the field, and I call those models deficit models. And in this perspective, there is certainly some truth. It is true that some forms of adversity can impair brain structure and function in ways that lower cognitive abilities. But what I would like to argue is that this is not the whole story. And so, yes, this should be part of the research we're doing, but actually, in some cases, when we think we're seeing deficits, we're seeing adaptive responses. And in some cases, we also see actually strengths or enhancements of cognitive abilities. And yes, there are also cases where we see impairments. So the full picture requires a balanced view that considers impairment processes as well as adaptation processes. Now, we tend to distinguish between two types of conditional adaptation. So what do I mean by conditional? I mean conditional in the sense that it's conditional on the environment in which an individual is. So an individual is adapting to a particular environment. Their behavior or their cognition is conditioned on their environment. And we distinguish between hidden talents, and those are abilities that are enhanced by solving challenges in a particular environment. So enhanced abilities, and strategies. And those are decisions or responses that are tailored to the structure of the environment in a way that makes adaptive sense. Now, this distinction might seem a little bit abstract now, but it's going to become clear very soon. So let me start with strategies. Imagine, like so many of the people you're working with, you grow up in a world that you perceive to be chaotic. You perceive at least, some or many other people as undependable. Your circumstances are largely uncontrollable. Now, in those circumstances, people tend to prefer immediate over future rewards. So all people prefer immediate over future rewards, but the extent to which we favor these immediate rewards over future rewards, that varies between individuals. And so some people are, quite happy to delay gratification and sort of reap a larger later reward, and other people prefer the more immediate reward. Now, if you grow up in a world where future promises are actually quite unlikely to be realized, and it could be because other people are either unwilling or unable to actually provide the larger reward later, or it could be because you yourself are unsure whether or not you're actually going to be present around in this space to be able to actually get the reward. Maybe you're moving, maybe you're somewhere else, maybe you're evicted, maybe you're staying at your uncle's house. So in those contexts, people tend to prefer the immediate reward. And the way that this is talked about in the psychological literature is that people will say in a kind of, in my view, derogatory way, they will talk about people as being short-sighted or, a failure of the ability to delay gratification or, a lack of self-control. Now, in some cases, and so those are impairment framings. And in some cases, when people discount the future, I think those impairment phrases do apply. So I don't think they never apply. In some cases, they do apply. But in other cases, what we're seeing is really a reasonable response to an environment that's structured in a way where future rewards are highly uncertain. And so the individual is just taking the immediate reward because that they get with more certainty. And what's really interesting is that if you take children who actually do come from kind of safe, stable environments, and you put them in an experimental setting where you give them the marshmallow task, maybe some of you know the marshmallow test, you get one marshmallow now or two marshmallows later. And then, the question is, how long do people wait for the second marshmallow? And usually, up to about 15 minutes. And then the experimenter gives the second marshmallow. Now, people struggle to wait. Some people don't wait at all. They immediately take the marshmallow. Other people do wait. Some people open up the marshmallow, take a little bit from the middle, put it in their mouth, and try to close the marshmallow so it looks as though they haven't eaten part of the marshmallow in the hopes that they get a second one. But what's interesting is that these children that do grow up in these safe, stable environments, if they believe that the experimenter is unreliable, and so they've done a study where the experimenter basically made a promise to them, then failed to deliver the promise, and then they did the marshmallow test. And so then the children believed, hey, this experimenter is not reliable. Then the children barely waited for the second marshmallow. Okay, so children can actually adjust whether they discount the future more or less based on the reliability, even in the current context, not just as a function of sort of longer term childhood experiences. But it's showing that people are able to make these kinds of adjustments in their behavior in a way that makes adaptive sense. Now, what are these hidden talents, those enhanced abilities? So here, actually, I knew of one study before I started doing this line of work myself that to me really fits this profile. There was a work by Seth Pollack and colleagues from more than 20 years ago where they showed that children who've experienced severe physical abuse, and so these were children who actually were taken out of their own houses because the abuse was so severe. These children, when they were given emotion recognition tasks, when the pictures of the emotional faces were sort of partially visible, they weren't fully degraded, but they also weren't fully visible. They were sort of, there was some information there, but it was kind of hard to see. In that space, these children were more accurate in recognizing the emotion of anger in these faces, more accurate than children who had not experienced this type of abuse. And this was not true for other emotional expressions like happy or sad. In this study, it was also not the case that the children were just responding to kind of almost any face as, oh, this is probably an angry face. That would be called a hostile attribution bias, where you over-ascribe anger. That could also get you high accuracy on the angry faces, but then you would have very low accuracy on happy because you would have labeled them angry very often. And that was not the case in this study. There are other studies where people do find this hostile attribution bias. Okay, but this was showing an enhanced ability, and you can see how that's different than just adjusting your decision making or your behavior based on the structure of your environment, like whether future rewards are likely to actually be present for you. But here you see an enhanced psychological ability, which is to detect the emotional expressions on a face. But there weren't many studies like this at all. And so in 2013, I wrote a paper, and that paper has sort of influenced the field in that it has generated more and more research on these mental abilities that might be strengthened in conditions of adversity. And we call this the hidden talents approach. And the title of this paper is, Does early life exposure to stress shape or impair cognition? Well, I think the answer in some cases also is both. And we outlined 4 questions. And so first, what challenges do people face in a given environment? So some children experience nutritional deprivation, others experience violence, others experience, unpredictability. Are you experiencing these things within the family and or within the neighborhood? What about the school setting? And so you really need to think about what are the challenges an individual faces, because the kinds of skills that people might develop for dealing with these challenges would differ. And so, depending on the challenge, we might expect different skills to develop. If you're in a dangerous environment, maybe recognizing danger. But if you're in an environment where there's unpredictability, you might, for example, start preferring immediate rewards. Now, what instruments best measure these skills? And so this sounds like maybe a little bit of a dry question, but really it's a fascinating question. Let's think back about these children growing up in Brazil, selling fruits and vegetables on the streets. There were totally different estimates of their abilities when they were tested on the street versus when they were tested in the classroom. So it really matters how we measure people for what we learn about what they are able to do. And then finally, if we detect strengths in individuals, how can we leverage those in ways that benefit them and that benefit society as well? So, for example, one of the things where I and others have found enhancements is in empathic accuracy. So, the ability to kind of recognize the internal states of other people. So, this is work that I've done together with Susan Brenner. She led the study, she was at the University of Utah. But there are other researchers who already made this discovery before we did from the University of Berkeley. And so they showed also that people from low SES backgrounds, now low socioeconomic backgrounds is not the same as adversity. We should not equate the two, but it is true that in lower SES environments, adversity is more prevalent. People in those environments are more accurate at recognizing the internal states of other people. Now, there might be exceptions to this, for example, if people are suffering from psychopathology, but when people are within the non-psychopathology range, their empathic accuracy can be enhanced. Now, other people have applied this perspective to studying executive function. So executive functioning is about sort of making a plan and then trying to think through what are the steps that I need to do to get there and how can I ban out sort of the things that are distracting me from reaching that plan. And so that requires things like keeping track of a changing environment. And this ability to keep track of a changing environment is something where we've also seen, in some cases, enhancements in people who are living in an unpredictable environment, particularly if the the stimuli or the research materials that we're working with are materials that are familiar to them, that are relevant to them, like money or faces. That improves their performance relative to something like a geometric shape, like a triangle or an abstract symbol. And so this perspective that there can be these cognitive strengths has been now applied to a variety of domains. And that's a very exciting new area of research in the field. It's also a new area of research, and that means that there's a lot we don't know yet. So I really don't want to overstate or oversell this perspective, but it is a perspective that is now gaining ground, and more people are starting to look for these strengths. Whereas in the past sort of 50 years, pretty much almost all research was focusing on deficits. Okay, so then the new pathways to improving lives, that's the final part of my talk, and that's the most applied part. And so, what I've tried to do from a bigger picture perspective is I've tried to say that when we study people growing up in these challenging environments, we don't only want to look at deficits. Yes, those deficits may exist, but they may also have developed adaptations in the form of behavioral strategies or in the form of enhanced mental abilities. And those we should also try to understand. And with that more well-rounded view, we can try to serve people better. Now, some of the areas where this way of thinking can have applications are in education. And so there's work by Christina Bauer, Ivan Hernandez, but also David Silverman. They are studying academic persistence. And in their work, they are not actually measuring people's cognitive abilities or behavioral strategies, but what they are doing is they're talking with people who have had exposures to adversity about what strengths they think they might have gained from growing up in these conditions and what strategies they developed for navigating the difficult situations that they encountered and how they might be able to leverage those strategies or those skills in the current context where they are pursuing an education. And so what their work shows, and so it's different from the work that I'm doing because I'm trying to measure those strategies and those skills. They are not measuring those, but they are trying to talk to people about those skills and strategies. And then that helps people feel more resilient when they have setbacks. And so when youth who have gone through their intervention then have setbacks, they are less likely to drop out of educational programs. And so there have been repeated measures, including up to 6 months later after the intervention. And those youths that have gone through the strength-based intervention are less likely to drop out. And they don't know the exact mechanisms at work here. But what could be the case is that, for example, these youth might have one or two or three bad grades. And rather than thinking, I don't belong here, oh yeah, I'm not, just like my dad told me, I'm not smart, I shouldn't be here. Whatever negative feedback they might have received from their environment or whichever things they inferred from seeing very few people like them, for example, at this prestigious university where they're studying or something like that, or this college, maybe what they're thinking is, I have actually been very resourceful in the past when navigating these really difficult situations. And this is another difficult situation. I'm going to try to really do as much as I can to, to overcome it. And so, anyway, these interventions seem to work, but we don't exactly know what's happening and why they work. But I think they're very interesting. Now, also, I already mentioned the finding that with these tasks where people need to keep track of changing environments, the content of the materials matters, right? Is it about money or faces, or is it about more abstract things like triangles or symbols? And so this could have implications for how we think about educational settings, like classroom settings. When we try to teach children, particularly children who have experienced high levels of adversity, new skills, do we start maybe with the very abstract stuff, which might feel sort of far away for them and less relevant? Or do we start with things that are more relevant to them and then gradually kind of fade towards more abstract information because ultimately that's also something that they need to master. And so there are reasons to think that these more concrete approaches can be helpful for youth in those environments. And we've also made an animation that explains this. And so if you're interested, I'll be also happy to share my slides, of course, with Christina and Angela and the other organizers. Um, and then you can have a look at this 5-minute animation, which I made together with the Jacobs Foundation. And it's explaining how these um, these strengths and these strategies can be leveraged in classroom settings. I will say, though, that it is still, in some sense, uncharted territory in the sense that there are other recent studies that we and others have done which show that in some cases, the concreteness of the materials can actually also interfere with learning. So, for example, people who really struggle with money, people who are in the lowest SES bracket, when they need to solve math problems about money, it can actually capture their attention away from solving the mathematical problem and remind them of their everyday problems. Like, I cannot get food on the table this evening. I cannot pay rent this month. And that can actually then lower their performance on a particular math item on a test. And not actually just on that item, but also on a subsequent item and a subsequent item. And then they sort of trickle over, and then their performance again normalizes for their ability level. And so it's complicated what the different contents are doing. But what is very clear from many studies is that the content matters a lot for people with more adversity exposure, whereas for people with low adversity exposure, whether it's abstract or concrete or about money or faces or anything else, it doesn't really matter so much for their performance usually. Another thing where this really matters is for public discourse. And so the public discourse about people growing up in poverty or with other forms of adversity tends to be deficit oriented. And so I'm showing here two titles of papers, and I don't want to pick on any particular researcher or any particular paper. I have a lot of respect for actually, the researchers that I'm also voicing some criticisms about some of their theoretical thinking or about some of their work. I have a lot of respect for their work, but I do have issues with titles like The Poor's Poor Mental Power or Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function. These are titles in papers that are published in Science. And so Science is one of the most highly visible scientific journals. It's really also picked up by journalists and by, it's going all across the globe when things are published in those journals. And then people will write news articles like poverty shrinks children's brains and other types of very, I would say stigmatizing language. And so I think this more well-rounded view can also push the public discourse towards a more balanced approach. I just want to show one more quote from a working group that actually is trying to help people growing up in conditions of lower resources. And this is a working group of human capital and economic opportunity. And yet they too use this deficit discourse, even though their intentions are clearly really to help people in these conditions. They write that children from low SES families were more impatient, more risk-taking, less altruistic, and had lower IQ scores. Okay. Now, I think the research findings of these studies can be discussed. It's not like we cannot, talk about the research findings of studies, whatever they are, but we have to be really careful about the language we choose. And we also need to make sure that we highlight some of the strategies and strengths alongside some of the cases where there's lower performance. So things like empathic accuracy being enhanced, or the ability to track changes in the environment, or to detect information in the periphery. Because you're vigilant, you might be able to detect things in the periphery better. Those things should also be highlighted so there's a much more balanced view. And so I think it's problematic when we only see language like this being used in public discourse. And so for that reason, um, I also want to highlight that what the general public takes away from this kind of deficit discourse is something about the problems that people living in poverty or with other adversities have being a problem of the individual more than a problem of the context within which these individuals are growing up. And so we've done research on, what do people take away when we say something like in neighborhood X, there's a lot of violence. this violence is mainly because, and then we can fill in different things, in the dots. So we could say, because there are young men, that have high levels of testosterone, right? Or we can say, because in this environment, there are very few opportunities for young men to find jobs. So there we make a more contextual explanation. And so you can give different types of explanations that are all hypothetical. And then you ask people, what kind of intervention do you think will be effective in lowering the levels of violence in this neighborhood? And whether people think the explanation is something biological, something that's kind of inside the individual. If they think that, they think that it's a problem of the individual that needs to be addressed at the individual level. Whereas if they understand that this is actually something that's also largely contextual, then people think, oh, we should create jobs, we should create more opportunities, we should try to make sure these neighborhoods are safer, that people's basic needs are met. And so, whatever one's kind of political leanings might be, what matters here is that how we frame our scientific conclusions will also affect what the general public takes away about which types of policies will be effective in addressing problems within our society. And so I started a research network in 2022 with mainly early career researchers who come from ethnically and socio-economically diverse backgrounds. And this network is called Communicating and Expanding Research on Adversity. And with this network, we're trying to put forth a more balanced view of what adversity does to people and what the implications are for things like policy and other areas of life. We create science communication products ranging from very accessible infographics to kind of more scientific papers. So, for example, here's an infographic that is explaining how people might develop strengths alongside struggles. I'm not going to go through the whole infographic, but it's explaining some of the research findings in a highly accessible manner for a broad audience. We also talk about misconceptions of this balanced approach. So it has happened to me, unfortunately, that people have said to me something like this, and I'm now going to say something that I completely do not agree with, but people have asked things like, well, if people can adapt to adversity to some extent, does that mean that we should invest less in, addressing systemic inequalities or something like that? And I was like, no, not at all. Like we should very much, we should really address those inequalities. And yet we should also, when people are growing up in those circumstances, we should try to do justice to the whole picture. And so we make, science communication products trying to make sure that people understand what we don't mean when we're trying to take a balanced approach. I already mentioned that we also have work on policy implications of a strength-based approach. This is a paper led by Mariah Joseph and Monica Elwood-Lowe, both at Stanford University. Okay, so to conclude, so adaptive plasticity, the ability of organisms to adjust their characteristics to their environment, can be favored by the evolutionary process when organisms, like the little Daphnia, but also human infants and children, have access to information that they can use to learn about their environment. And humans have evolved the ability not only to, develop adaptations to acute stressors, but also in some cases to these more prolonged stressors like threat or unpredictability or low levels of nutritional resources in the environment. And so people may not only develop vulnerabilities, but also strategies and strengths in these stressful conditions. And considering these strengths and strategies affords building new and positive pathways to improving people's lives. And with that, I'd just like to thank my funders, the Dutch Research Council, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Jacobs Foundation, and the James McDonald Foundation. And now I really look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I am looking into the chat, and before I ask my own question, I will see what we have. So Cindy says, I appreciate your perspective. In my clinical experience, I have observed that people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences have developed many strengths and special abilities that they often do not perceive as strengths and special abilities. When we're able to shift their perspective and they are able to view these strengths and abilities as adaptive and positive, people begin to thrive in ways they hadn't been able to envision for themselves before. Thank you for this important talk. So,
Can I
comment.
just say that I just love the way that you phrase this. This is such a spot on and beautiful way to phrase it, and making people aware of those strengths, how that all by itself already can have this positive impact is amazing. And one of the things, whenever I talk to people who are interfacing on a regular basis, practitioners who are working with people in adverse environments, I am often just struck by the insights that they have, and the understanding that they can bring and give me also. And so I sometimes think there's kind of a discrepancy between the science, where people are really mainly deficit focused, and then the practitioners who have a much more well-rounded perspective. And so this to me is another um, testimony to that. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let people have some time to enter some other things in the chat, but I was thinking about your slide where you listed, executive function, cooperation, empathy, and creativity as all areas that where we're starting to see some strengths. And you talked a little bit about educational context and I guess just sort of echoing what Cindy was saying in the chat. I'm thinking about maybe if you could elaborate in some of those areas, um, what has been found, but then also how that might impact a more clinical arena for some of our audience members. I'm thinking about things like sometimes we think of the deficits, for example, in executive function areas. We think,
Mhm.
gosh, folks with, who have these experiences and these traumatic histories are often they have difficulty planning. And so when I'm trying to work with folks, they often are not showing up to appointments and they're having trouble with their medication management. And goodness, this is so difficult for me as a provider, because I'm struggling with these aspects of folks who have these histories. So I'm wondering if there's ways that we can reframe, how we're thinking of clinically about some of the strengths that may be present or that we can try to leverage for in a clinical context.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So first, just briefly say something about the executive functioning findings. And because, in this talk, I didn't have a lot of time to kind of flesh out what the findings are there. And so the general pattern, and I'm sure this is something that many of you will be aware of, is that people growing up in context of adversity tend to score lower on tests of executive functioning. And that's also true in our research. And so the conclusion of the sort of standard approach is that they have deficits in their executive functioning, and that that's part of the explanation of the problems that people have. It can create poverty traps, for example, where people in poverty might have lower executive functioning, therefore they might make decisions that perpetuate their being in poverty, for example. And so those are sort of widely held views. Now, some of the nuances that we've brought to that literature is that we've done approaches where we've given people multiple executive functioning tests. Okay, so the same individuals making multiple tests. Other people have done this as well. But what then people often will do is they will either analyze the results of each test separately, and they will conclude that there's a deficit in disability, in disability, and deficit in disability, or they will aggregate and say, oh, there is a deficit in executive functioning in aggregate. But what we've done, and fewer people have done this, is we've separated sort of mental abilities that are really specific to the executive functioning versus abilities that are more general. So, like processing speed, for example, how fast do people process information? That's something that's going to affect performance on each executive functioning test. And so, if you distinguish between these specific ability processes and these more general processes, then what we see is that people from more adverse backgrounds either tend to process information more slowly or they are more cautious. And if you're cautious, you respond more slowly. to tasks. And that will result in lower performance on many of these executive functioning tasks. And so if I grow up in an adverse environment and I develop a cautious strategy where I always want to gather a bit more information before I make a decision, because if I'm wrong, it's costly. So now I'm going to score lower on various executive functioning tasks, not because those specific abilities are impaired, but because my strategy more generally is cautious. And so once you control statistically for this cautious strategy, then you don't see any more impairments or very much smaller impairments on these specific abilities. So that's just an example of the kind of nuance. Um, Now, what would that mean for something like a clinical perspective for clinical interventions, that maybe it's not these specific abilities that are impaired, but some more general processes are different, which affect these other. That's something that I do not have a good answer to yet. But one of the exciting things for me is to exchange ideas with people in this group and with you to think through what could be applications of this. Let me also just briefly say something about cooperation. So the work by Andrea Dittmann, she's a researcher who has shown that if you give people tasks that can only be solved cooperatively, then youth from lower SES backgrounds, which again is not the same as adversity, but it's correlated with it, they perform better on these cooperative tasks. Children from higher SES backgrounds are more likely to say, let me solve it. I can do it. I'm going to do it by myself. They have sort of developed this mindset where they need to do things themselves independently more. Whereas these children in the lower SES backgrounds are more likely to say, how can we solve this together? And so they hit the solution sooner. Now, there are already interventions leveraging kind of cooperative learning in classroom settings that seem to be, and I'm not an expert in the educational literature, but my reading of that literature is that those interventions seem to work better for youth from lower SES backgrounds also. So learning together rather than it's me, I learn individually, I'm tested individually. It's like together we're trying to learn things and we're mutually, enhancing each other's learning. Those types of contexts could have practical implications for how we design the learning environment. But for me, in the same way that I'm now talking to people with clinical expertise, I'm not an educational scientist. For me, talking with people in educational science about these types of things is a great synergy.
Thank you so much. We do have lots of comments coming in. Lisa says, I loved this talk. Have you looked at strengths in neglected and isolated children? My friend's granddaughter didn't have social interaction for her first 5 years as she was in a room just with her parents who were using on drugs.
Mm,
She only had a few toys and didn't eat a variety of foods. I don't think the parents were exceptionally abusive physically, but she does have some language deficits.
mhm,
She adds that's so hard. So
mm.
have you looked at strengths in neglected and isolated
Phew.
children?
Um, So we have not studied individuals with such severe forms of deprivation. And there are people who have extensively studied children who grew up in orphanages in Eastern Europe, for example, where the conditions were also harsh. Those conditions were, of course, in several ways different from the conditions described in this example. But there too, for example, the children were, not receiving nutrition or attention socially contingent on their own behavior. So the care is very regimented there. And so it's not the case that you would, um, if you would solicit, if you'd ask for help or something that they would help. So we haven't studied this. What has happened to me a few times, and actually I think that in such severe circumstances, it could be the case that the impairment processes is kind of dominating over the adaptation processes. But I do think there could be also in those circumstances some adaptations. And one of the things that's happened when I wrote this article in 2013, for the first time in my scientific life, I got a letter from a person, a person who wasn't a scientist. I think it was a student, but um, and this person, that letter was very moving to me. And the person sort of thanked me for writing the article and said, this is the first time that I see a scientific article where I kind of recognize something of my own experiences. And this was a person who had experienced very severe deprivation. And this person had also grown up in an orphanage. And one of the things that this person explained to me is that they had like a cuddly toy. I don't know what the exact English word is, but like something that children, hold when they want to fall asleep and things like that. And whenever she was doing something that the caregivers didn't like, they would take that toy away from her. Instead of consoling or comforting, they would take away something precious to her to silence her. And and she said that's led me to always hide how I feel about things to other people, because if people don't know how I feel about something, they also cannot use it against me. And so and so in the new context, in this loving, warm context that she ended up later in her life after the adoption, that created a mismatch in a sense, because now she wasn't being communicative about how she felt about things where other people could, um, help her thrive. But she viewed that herself. She said, even though the clinicians that I work with see that as mainly a deficit in me, I know that this was a strategy that I needed as a child to, and I know also that many clinicians would recognize that would have been a strategy as a child that was now mismatched maybe in the new environment. So then trying to help people to kind of revise their strategies when they are in an improved context is of course a big part of what clinicians also try to accomplish.
Well, thank you very much. There's a couple other comments in the chat, and I have copied those so I can give them to you later. But we are at time, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I really thank you for coming today and giving us this important presentation. And this was wonderful. So thank you so much, Dr.
Well,
Frankel.
thank you too, and thanks everyone in the audience for your thoughtful and interesting comments as well.
Okay.